Well, I think people are joining us, which is lovely. And maybe we will, start. And as people join in, they'll catch up. I want to just, first of all, my name is Lael Chester, and I am the director of the Emerging Adult Justice Project at Columbia University's Justice Lab. And our mission is to inform and drive developmentally appropriate, effective, and fair justice responses that advance successful paths to adulthood for all emerging adults, which we define as about 18 to 25, that period we're transitioning into adulthood. We want to welcome everyone for joining our discussion today about specialized parole and resentencing laws for emerging adults. This is a burgeoning field. There's been a flurry of innovative practices and policies implemented across the country in just the last 5 years. Some are local practices. Examples might be a specialized court for emerging adults or specialized units, correctional units for emerging adults. And some of these innovations have been statewide policies. Examples of that are youthful offender laws are often called, the name is a sort of a hybrid system where emerging adults and sometimes younger youth experienced a kind of combined system that is partly some elements of the juvenile justice system, such as confidentiality, with elements of the criminal legal system. Another example would be raising the upper age of juvenile jurisdictions. So Vermont, for example, has passed law and is now implementing a law that expands the juvenile justice system to the 20th birthday, right? The first in the country to go over the 18th birthday, but other states are sort of following suit. The topic of this event focuses on that latter, right? The statewide or jurisdiction-wide systemic reforms. We'll be learning about jurisdictions that have or are proposing to apply research on what we know about emerging adults to cases involving sentences of incarceration. And the discussion today will be about rethinking the decision-making process used to determine when folks should be released. This is an emotional topic. I want to do a shout out to the Osborne Association that had a panel discussion on similar topics last week, and I was really struck by how they took the time to recognize that folks on the phone have experienced the trauma of incarceration, and that this is a difficult subject. And so I want to echo that here today. I want to mention that this event is being recorded. So folks who aren't able to join us this hour can listen in later and learn from the experts on the panel. We have turned off, or attempting to turn off, maybe we've done it, the video and the sound for everyone other than the panelists. At the top of your screen is a little box. It says gallery view that you can kind of play with if you want to sort of see how the boxes work and what works for you best. I know that some folks have experienced Zoom bombing recently. I unfortunately have not had to do that yet, but I'm hoping it doesn't happen today, and we've done what we can to prevent it. So we've got a great panel today, and just to start us off, I'm going to introduce Natalie Baer. She is a third-year law school student at Columbia University Law School. She is the former Law and Policy Research Associate at our project, the Emerging Adult Justice Project. And she's the chief author of the report on specialized parole and resentencing that we're releasing today in conjunction with this event. Natalie is pursuing a career fighting for the rights and affirming the dignity of those in the criminal system. And after law school, she plans to go into public defense. So Natalie's going to share with us some of the paper's findings and the highlights from her national research and analysis of specialized parole and resentencing laws for emerging adults. So thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Lael, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lael mentioned, there's a burgeoning body of scientific research on young adult development that has led to this movement of reforms kind of specifying or specialized towards emerging adults in the criminal system. Previously, for the past couple centuries, or the past century, a little over a century, emerging adults have been treated as either in the juvenile system or in the adult system, but this is beginning to change. As Lael mentioned, there have been a number of reforms nationwide to try to bring specialized approaches to this age group, to try to tailor the system to a more developmentally appropriate treatment, as this population is well overrepresented in the criminal system, and based on high recidivism rates, the current treatment of this population is not effective, and is unfair. So states across the country have recently enacted certain reforms, and this panel and this paper look specifically at one kind of mechanism of reform. It looks at parole and resentencing laws tailored to this age group of 18 to 25. So several jurisdictions, this paper looks at 5 specifically, and we have a number of representatives on this panel that are going to talk a little bit more in detail about these different jurisdictions, but 5 jurisdictions have either passed laws or are considering laws, have proposed specific reforms that would provide a second look, a sort of review of a person's sentence if that person was convicted of a crime committed while they were an emerging adult, while they were somewhere between the age of 18 to 25. So the paper first looks at California, which was the first state to enact this kind of law, which has, it and Illinois have looked specifically at kind of a parole release mechanism. And so essentially a person would be eligible after serving a certain number of years or a certain percentage of their sentence. They would then be eligible for a parole review of that sentence. And the parole board would have to consider certain factors, such as their youthfulness at the time of the offense and their growth and maturation since the offense while they have been incarcerated. And then the 3 other jurisdictions that the paper reviews, which are DC, Colorado, and Florida, policymakers in these 3 other jurisdictions proposed similar bills. So in Colorado, there's a similar bill that looks at early release on parole opportunities. And then in DC and Florida, where parole has been abolished in the late 20th century, the mechanism is slightly different, but it would have the same effect. So essentially, when a person who has been convicted of committing a crime while they were between ages 18 and 25 has served a certain number of years of their sentence, and the number, in all of these laws changes based on the crime of conviction. After they've served a certain number of years, then they would be able to petition to the sentencing court, the court that sentenced them, for a sentence reduction. So it would end up kind of having the same effect as these parole bills, which is why we have looked at them all in the same paper and are talking about them all today. And so we're really lucky to have representatives from these different states here to talk a little bit more in detail about these different proposals in the bills that have already passed, and to look a little bit more at the successes that California in specific on the call has experienced with this bill, or with the law that they've passed. And so, the one other thing to mention is that California has a little bit of preliminary data. There's not much preliminary data in this paper, but California has provided a little bit of preliminary data, as has DC, which has a similar kind of bill, but focused more on juveniles, and now they're looking towards people in this age range. And the preliminary data has been very optimistic. It provides a lot of optimism for this mechanism of addressing this age group in the system.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. Really appreciate that. Yeah, so we're gonna first turn to California, right? California has passed the law. It's pretty robust in terms of the age range, and they now have some experience there. And so we've got 2 panelists. They're gonna walk us through a little bit of the California experience. I'm gonna just quickly, I was telling everybody before that the bios are enormous and impressive. And so I am shortening, which is apparently not fair, but just so you get a sense of the expertise of the people speaking today. So from California, we've got Frankie Guzman. He's an attorney and director of the California Youth Justice Initiative at the National Center for Youth Law, where he and his team work to eliminate the practice of prosecuting and incarcerating children in California's adult criminal legal system, to reduce incarceration and justice system involvement, and to increase developmentally appropriate services in communities for youth. In the last 3 years, we've had the great fortune to have Frankie join us and participate as a member of the emerging adult justice learning community at the Justice Lab, where we've been exploring research, practice, and policies in this field and to combat extreme inequities. He is going to be joined with John Wyndham, who is from South Sacramento, California, and serves as CEO of a nonprofit he founded called We All We Got. John is a community leader, human rights activist, and member of Initiate Justice, Institute of Impacted Leaders. He is a leader and a spokesman for ending mass incarceration, and a humanist who stands for the rights of anyone or group that is suffering an injustice. So I'm thrilled to have both of them on the West Coast, much earlier in the morning than the East Coast. And I'm going to start with Frankie, who I'm hoping you can just give us a little bit of background on what led to the California law. How did you get there, and what has sort of happened since its enactment, both legally, but also in terms of culture and culture change?
Yes, thank you, Lael. And so good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Frankie, and I'm here to talk a little bit about our experience in California with our youth offender parole laws. But before I discuss what that is and how that's worked out, I'd just like to give a little background, about how it is that we got to establish these youth offender parole processes, what the problem is that we were trying to address. And so I imagine, like many other states around the country, beginning in the 1980s and into the 1990s and early 2000s, California had really suffered from, over-reliance on prison and punishment to deal with a lot of society's issues, and most heavily impacting Black and brown communities and young men of color. The truth is that we were, because of our harsh prosecutions, our mandatory sentencing, gang enhancements, gun enhancements, that DAs and other law enforcement groups successfully legislated, our experience was many times judges felt like their hands were tied and didn't have discretion to fashion sentences in a reasonable and responsible way, but instead ended up giving, some young people, teenagers, as much as 300 years to life in prison, oftentimes where nobody even died in the crime because of the various enhancements that were tacked on to the underlying offenses. And so what we had was far too many people being sent to prison for too many reasons for too long of times. And what that resulted in was our 33 prisons in California were filled to 200% of the design capacity. So we had about 33 prisons with the design capacity of about 80,000, with 160,000 prisoners warehoused, crammed into these, pretty much anywhere that they could fit a prisoner, they did, whether they're in hallways and day rooms and recreation gyms, and conditions got pretty bad. It got so bad that there was a number of lawsuits that originated out of California against the Department of Corrections due to the prison overcrowding. And many of the facts alleged, some of the facts that were alleged were that, one person was dying in California prisons every 6 days due to a preventable cause or illness, something that could have absolutely been dealt with had they had an adequate healthcare system. But they also had issues with mental health services and many other issues that resulted in, as the Supreme Court deemed it, cruel and unusual punishment. So in 2010, the Supreme Court ordered California to reduce our prison population to 127% of its design capacity. So still well above what it was designed to hold, but not anywhere close to the 200% capacity that I was in at that time. Over the years, California tried a number of measures to try to reduce the prison population that failed, and it became apparent, and I would say imminent, that the federal government was going to intervene and take over the California prison system and put it under the control of a federal receiver, which I know that the governor at the time and the prison administration did not want. And so there was a lot of creative efforts to get our prison population down. One was AB 109 realignment, which ultimately returned people that were sentenced to prison for nonviolent, non-serious, and non-sex offense crimes back to the counties and paid the counties some money to basically warehouse these people in county jail. There was also Prop 47, which reclassified a number of seven low-level felonies to misdemeanors, felonies like drug possession and petty theft. There was a lot of criticism by law enforcement because of these measures. I think the argument generally was, these are get out of jail free cards. That's going to cause this, the sky to fall, and the earth will crumble if this happens. And none of that really happened. But there was still that fear because of these narratives that these are dangerous people who are in prison and need to be locked up. Where I think our state just couldn't deal with it. We couldn't build ourselves into build more prisons to build ourselves out of this problem. So meanwhile, there was also a separate effort of community organizations, I would say being led by Elizabeth Calvin at Human Rights Watch in Los Angeles, that was really focused on ending life without parole for juveniles. And around this time, 2010, they passed a bill, SB 9, which gave relief to about 350 young people who were serving life in prison for crimes they committed as juveniles. And once that was passed, the focus then turned to, what about all these other young people who don't have a legally speaking, technically speaking, a life without parole sentence, but still have no expectation of coming home because of a 300-year to life or 100-year to life sentence. And so for these young people, we developed this youth offender parole process. And it took a lot of years to get to this point, but Elizabeth will say about 7 years to get to this point. But ultimately in 2013, by working with our legislature, developing champions from within, but also working with crime victims, people who had lost loved ones due to violence caused by young people, as well as people who had returned from prison settings like myself, going to the legislature, educating legislators about the true impact of crime. And I'll just note that there's a lot of conversation about crime victims and what crime victims want, but Californians for Safety and Justice has done research in California, at least, about crime victims, who they are and what they believe. And what we've learned is that overwhelmingly the profile of a crime victim is a Black and brown male under age 30, who is also, I would say not coincidentally, the people that we're talking about here with the emerging adult justice. These are young Black and brown men who have been marginalized, have serious disadvantage, and oftentimes are both the victim and the perpetrator of the crimes that we tend to overpunish. So as that bill was passed and was being legislated, implemented, Elizabeth Calvin, myself, and a number of other attorneys would go into prisons and educate prison guards, the wardens, so the prison administrators, as well as the people who could benefit from this. And it took a lot of time to earn their trust, because up until that time, very few people were being paroled. California, many governors in a row had a policy of no parole. I know that Gray Davis had even made statements about the only way a person was going to leave prison who had a life sentence was through a pine box. And it did a lot to remove hope from prison yards. I think it did a lot to exacerbate the despair and the hopelessness that was pretty deep in prison yards, that increased violence, increased, I would just say, the negativity that the prisoners had to live with and that the guards had to deal with. And so I'll just take this opportunity to just say one thing. This youth offender parole process, I can distinguish from the realignment, which strictly moved responsibility from state to local over the care over bodies, essentially, and Prop 47, which reclassified felonies to misdemeanors, but did very little to incentivize, encourage, or in any way facilitate rehabilitation prior to release. With the youth offender parole laws, the way it works is, if a person is committed to prison for a crime they committed as a youth, they have to serve a minimum of 15, 20, or 25 years, depending on the sentence. But let's say no later than their 25th year, they will go to a parole board hearing. And at that parole board hearing, 2 parole commissioners, overwhelmingly former law enforcement officials, essentially vet this person, looking at the facts of the crime, it's a discussion, actually, a discussion of the facts of the crime with the prisoner, the life before the crime, life since their incarceration, any subsequent growth and learnings that they've developed, and also their parole plans. If in that conversation, the parole commissioners make a determination that the person before them still poses a significant risk to public safety, then they are empowered to deny that person parole. If they find that this person is no longer a public safety threat, then they release that person. And I'm glad that John is on this call and will be following behind me in this presentation, because I'd like to hear from him, how that worked out, but what I can say now, just, as an end result, by creating a pathway that was not a get out of jail free card, but simply an opportunity for people to engage in a rehabilitative program. We created the opportunities, we brought in the services through volunteers, and we incentivized through this, parole process that for many resulted in a much sooner parole hearing date. Keep in mind those 100-year to life, 300-year to life cases. We're now going to go to parole board in their 25th year of incarceration. At the outset, what it did was instill hope into an environment that had none. It created pathways in an environment that didn't have them, and it created guidance because people could really understand the process because it was legislated in statute, and they weren't, just allowed to guess. They knew what would happen, and over time, people did start going home. I think in the initial year, the parole grant rate was about 50% because there were many, many people in prison who no longer needed to be in prison, who had already rehabilitated, who were working the program, and as soon as the law passed, became immediately eligible for a parole hearing, and at their first parole hearing, went home, right? And so that is part of the data that we have. But since then, since 2013, we've continued to collect data, and what I can tell you is, one, we've begun to reduce the prison population in a very cost-effective way and very safely. Today, we have about 115,000 people, where at the height, we had more than 160,000 people in our prisons. The parole, the recidivism rate for the nearly 1,000 people that have gone home since 2013 under youth offender parole is less than 1%. It's about 0.6. So half of 1% have returned to prison for a new crime. It's made our community safer. A lot of the people who have worked the program to learn about themselves, to improve themselves, and to learn to give back to communities have done that in prison in order to get out, but have continued to do that once they've gotten out. And John is a good example of that. And so in that sense, it made our prison safer for the guards and for the prisoners who have to live there and work there. But as these people come home, it's also made our community safer by instilling a critical mass of people that have wisdom, that have that lived experience, and that have a lot to contribute to the very same people that we're talking about, Black and brown males under age 30, who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, but are also most likely to be over-policed, over-prosecuted, punished, and thrown away into these carceral systems. And so today, now we're in a good place. California is poised to close 2 prisons over the next 2 years. And I would like to, just say clearly, this youth offender parole process has worked, because we basically put the ball in the individual's court to work the program, to improve his or herself, and ultimately demonstrate subsequent growth and rehabilitation, rather than other things that might simply just look at, moving bodies around or reducing sentences without rehabilitation.
Great. Thank you very much, Frankie. I think, one thing I've learned being the Emerging Adult Justice Project is, right, the research showing how young people change so dramatically in this transition to adulthood, right? And that if given the opportunity, most will grow up and grow out of crime. The question is, does the justice system always allow them to do that, right? Are we, in a way, blocking them from doing that? So the numbers are, in one sense, sort of, right, super positive and potentially shocking that it's such a small recidivism rate. But on the other hand, if you consider the research, I don't think we necessarily should be shocked. People are not I'm not who I was when I was 18 or 20. Nobody is. It's just this tremendous growth and opportunity. So I want to turn it over to John. And John, I'm hoping you'll just spend a few minutes talking to us about how this law impacted you. In terms of what was happening and how you were feeling before the law was passed, and then what happened when the law was passed and what the impact was.
Okay. Again, my name is John. I was incarcerated for 30 years for aiding and abetting in a murder. So for me, before that law, and not just for myself, one thing about kids is kids hang in packs, no matter where they go, right? So myself and all the youngsters that I hung around, right? We were a bunch of kids running around the yard with no hope, which is what led us to prison in the first place. Not having hope, not foreseeing the future, not caring about anything or anyone, not even ourselves. It was said that we weren't going home, so we were making prison our home, which means we did anything to make ourselves feel at peace and comfortable inside of prison. And the last thing you want is someone to be comfortable inside of prison. But now you have these kids 16 to 25 years of age running around the yard doing every single thing that they could to numb the pain of being in prison or to inflict pain on others because of the pain that we were enduring, because we weren't going home and we had no hope and we were hurting. And along comes 260 and 261. First, it was all the talk about it, right? You begin to see the light come on, the light of hope turn on in youngsters' eyes when we just had the thought of this bill passing 260 and 261 about us having a chance to go home, right? Some of us gave up, and then some of us were going to programs and groups and wanting to change despite the law telling us that we'd never go home, and going to board numerous of times. I went to board 8 times before I was paroled. 8 times I went to board, 7 times I was denied parole. And I was in my 40s being denied for the things I did as a child. As a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old boy, I was being prosecuted over and over again at that board hearing until 260 and 261. But once this law changed and became law, you start seeing people go home. People that you knew that were worse than you were, as far as their activity, as far as the write-ups, as far as the hopelessness. And once we start seeing people go home, the light of hope cut on in our hearts and in our minds. People started to program. And we were talking about, when I said children hang in packs, they hang in packs inside of prison according to their race or according to their gang, right? When 261 came into play, all races came together. All of us young men banded together because we all had a common goal. We all now had incentive. We had no incentive to program before. So we start going to school, start educating ourselves, start learning more about the law, wanting to care about law, and teaching each other about law. So the violence decreased. Smiles on the yard increased instead of the angry and the mugging faces that you get because you've seen hurt people, right? But once that law passed, and I knew my board hearing was going to be different. It was my 6th board hearing. And every time they tell me, you're going home. You're not like those people. You're going home. They said I was different, but I wasn't. It's my 6th board hearing. I am one of those people because you keep denying me. But fast forward to my 7th hearing, which was the youth offender hearing. It was different. It was different. It wasn't so combative. And what really changes with 261 is they start to see you and go over your life as a child, right? All the things you did as a child. And I can speak to those things I did as a child now as a grown man, as an adult. So what we're doing is we're taking children and putting them inside of prisons, and then boys are growing up and becoming men, right? You're not taking grown men and putting them in prison, and you know these people are etched in stone. Even those people change, but they're etched in stone as to who they are, and understanding who they are, and their character has been fully developed, and they know who they are, right? But children, we go to prison and we learn who we are. And once we learn who we are, through programs, through groups, the whole prison changes. Like I said, it becomes less violent. It becomes a place of hope, a learning place. We always said that we weren't in prison. We were in a university, a higher learning of self and others. But that only came into play with 260 and 261 when you replaced the hope, when you gave back the incentive. Can't nothing but good come out of putting those things in place and not giving up on your youth, right? Make sure when these laws pass that children have programs or have people there that care about these youngsters' growth and maturity, because that's what you have to show in order to be paroled. And so my 8th hearing, they said that I had showed that growth and maturity, right? And that's why ultimately I was paroled 2 years ago. And since being paroled, all of us that were inside, all of us youngsters, because of 260 and 261, we all work together. All of our organizations are together, and we're out in our community together. We show up in each other's community as one and as a force, and we try to make changes for those youngsters to make sure that they don't go through the same things we went through, right? As far as the pitfalls and going to prison and jail and juvenile and all those things. But we also still reach back and help those youth that's going through 260 and 261 on the inside as well.
John,
because ultimately,
yeah, I might segue to Colorado and DC, right? I feel almost sorry for other panelists coming after that. And I will come back to everybody to have sort of final thoughts, but right, the description from John of sort of pre-law, post-law, it's more than an opportunity, a particular parole hearing. It's much more than that, right? It's about people feeling like they have a shot, they have a future, there is hope, and everything that impacts, as both John and Frankie described, in terms of programming, in terms of culture, in terms of attitude, in terms of mental health and emotional health, and and to have a parole hearing, right, as John described, right, where because of the law, there we're looking at developmental factors, right? There's sort of a different lens in which people are reviewing it, and the impact of that. And so I want to turn to Colorado and DC, because we have two final panelists who are both policymakers, right, who have proposed reforms, and can talk to us a little bit about that experience in these other states where California has been leading the way. So I'm going to give very quick bios again that do not do justice to anybody, but from Colorado, we have Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez, who is a third-generation North Denver resident of House District 4, where she was elected as state rep in 2018. She has worked in child welfare and juvenile justice field for the last 16 years, supporting victims of domestic violence, working with young females committed to the Division of Youth Services, as a social caseworker with the Denver Human Services, and in her current position as director of the Denver Collaborative Partnership. She's currently serving on the Judiciary and the Public Health Care and Human Services Committees, and is the Colorado Democratic Latina Caucus co-chair. Charles Allen was elected Ward 16 as a council member in Washington, D.C. during the 2014 election, and was re-elected to a second four-year term in 2018. He is chair of the council's Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety, as well as a member of the council's committees on education, transportation, environment, business and economic development, and labor and workforce development. He began his career in the district working on expanding healthcare options, and is devoted to leading on progressive social justice issues in DC and beyond. So obviously we're thrilled to have both of them here today. And both of them have taken a leadership position on these issues. And I guess I want to ask one question to both of you so we could take time. So we'll start with Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez and then move to Charles Allen, and we'll flip it the next question. But my first question is, why did you support reform in the release of people who are incarcerated?
Yeah, I'll add one other credential. I mentioned it earlier when we jumped on, is I'm also a mom of three kiddos. They're young children, but why get involved in this type of legislation? I've been working in the juvenile justice and child welfare field, and you see how these, there's a lot of intersectionalities. There's a lot of what we call crossover from child welfare to juvenile justice and back and forth. And working in that field for going on 17 years now, it keeps growing, but seeing that trajectory of young people that end up involved into the adult system. In Colorado, we implemented legislation in 2017 by who was actually my prime sponsor in the Senate, Senator Pete Lee, introduced this legislation in 2017, the JCAP, Juveniles Convicted as Adults program. And it was for exactly what John was describing, those that were convicted as adults under the age of 18, that were given life without parole, were given a chance to go through this kind of life skills program and then be possibly eligible for parole, so go in front of the parole board. And so what we, looking at that and looking at all of the research that has been done when it comes to that emerging adult population, 18 to up to 25, sometimes a little bit longer, and seeing the effects that this program has had on juveniles. And I hate to always differentiate, right? But because of our laws, we have to. We saw a need that how can we expand upon this? Over the last interim, I served on the Prison Population Management Interim Committee. And we were, again, similar to what California was talking about. We were looking at, why do we have so many people incarcerated for these lengths of time? People that are, in their 40s and 50s that were put there when they were 18, 19, 20 years old. And we went out and actually talked to a lot of these individuals in some of the facilities, met them, heard their personal stories, understood the things that they're working on. And every single one of them, when we asked them a question, we didn't talk about like brain development, we didn't talk about any of these things. And we specifically asked them, what was it that made it click for you? Because they were doing well, they, you know, as well as they could in prison, right? Like they were being a part of programming, taking advantage of groups that were offered, because there's a lot of inconsistencies there. And every single one of them said, when I was about 25, 26 years old, something just clicked. And that told me that I think what we were working on is the right thing to do. The last thing that I'll add is, you know, not only my professional experience, but I do, you know, have personal experience within my own family, my youngest brother. And, you know, it pains me to know that he was in that age group as well, when he got convicted, and seeing his path that he has had to take, and knowing that it could have looked different for him and all of the others like him.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, just of course, as I'm doing this, there's construction going outside my door. So I'll go back on mute in a second. Councilmember Allen, can you just give us a little background on, you know, your interest and support on this? I know it's sort of part of a package of youth reform that you've been leading and driving and working on, but just if you could just for a few minutes, just sort of give us that background.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. You know, maybe part of it is I come at this job. I'm the chair of the Judiciary Committee and have been for coming up on 4 years now. And maybe I just come from a very different place, which helped me be able to decide to try to tackle a lot of this. I'm not an attorney. I chair Judiciary. I don't have a legal background. My background is in public health and in social justice. Those are the two areas where I focused. And I think that actually helped me, frankly, come into some of these discussions and opportunities for reform without having fought the battles or having the scars to show for it. I was able to really come into some of this just in a very different space. And when I first took over the committee, there was a blistering series of reports by the Washington Post, which were just tearing apart something that we have in the district called the Youth Rehabilitation Act. And the YRA boiled down essentially is around how do you help a young person be able to have record sealing and changes in sentencing that tries to, what's supposed to be the R in YRA, rehabilitate and then be able to not shut down so many doors and paths forward. And it was this brutal series of some failures that were highlighted, but so much so that there was an effort to just completely remove this, and it would have been an incredible and dramatic shift in terms of the way that we treat young people in our sentencing. And I took that, I come into the committee and I take that on and basically spent the next kind of 8 months to 12 months working the politics of it, which were hard enough and could be a whole other hour-long conversation. But really spending the time to understand the data and the research and the processes. And at the end of it, we actually came out with something that it actually expanded the YRA. We did fix some of the things that I don't think were working the way it was intended, but we also actually ended up with an expansion of this effort for sentencing and record sealing reform for emerging adults up to age 25. That then set the stage for us to take the next steps. And the council had already passed something called IRA, which is the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which hits all the themes that we've talked about with just these lengthy sentences for kids. And we have been systemically working on expanding that reform and are close to being able to take the next big step in that to expand that through age 25 or up through age 24, up to age 25. And I don't need to convince anybody on this call about all the research behind it, but the research is critically important to being able to do that. But what I think underlines all of it, it's something that I heard John talk about, but as powerful as John's words are, I've heard from others with lived experience that speaks so powerfully. There's a 4-letter word that he talked about, hope. I can't tell you the number of times I have talked with people who've been able to come home or are fighting to come home. And it is what may be a simple concept, but it is incredibly powerful, and it has not existed in some people's lives in just such devastating ways. But the moment that there is true hope that takes place, you see so much change and so much possibility come around. And whether that's working with the YRA when a young person has made a mistake and we're trying to help make sure that it doesn't wreck the rest of their lives, or when you're talking to somebody who made a mistake when they were younger but is not that same person anymore and has so much potential and so much life to give and so much benefits to give. Hope is something that, we talk about. It's not this kind of mushy feeling. There's a way you can even quantify it, and you can see it make incredible change. And so I think coming at it from a public health perspective has helped me decide that I want to provide leadership and be a champion on these issues. And in just seeing the raw power of what happens when you give somebody hope, give someone's family hope, a community hope, it has the power to completely transform that person, their community, our city, into a more safe and more just place. And so those are some of the ways that we've really tried to approach this job.
Great, thank you very much. I want to follow up, point out, I guess I'm going to put Colorado on the spot again. Sorry, Representative Gonzalez-Gutierrez. You supported it. Could you give us a little sense of what happened in Colorado? What was the response to the proposal? And, just a little of the inside scoop on kind of the opponents that you've run on and maybe the supporters. And then also, if you wouldn't mind just telling us, like, what's next? What are your next steps? And in what ways can we, folks on this phone, help you and support your work?
Thank you. Yeah. So originally, the bill was originally proposed through our Prison Population Management Committee, and it was huge. It was a behemoth, and it had a lot of things in it that scared a lot of people. I mean, it went on the news and everybody was like, they want to release, sex offenders, and it was just completely blown out of proportion. Needless to say, I teamed up with Senator Pete Lee, who's worked in this space a lot in, restorative justice and juvenile justice and whatnot. And so we introduced a bill, and it was exactly, what I discussed earlier was expanding this JCAP program, but expanding it to those 18 to 24-year-olds that had committed a crime, a serious felony, that they could then also be eligible. And so what happened was, it was earlier this year. Our session runs typically from January to May. We all know, the world knows, COVID hit, and it had just made it through the Senate committee hearing and was on its way to appropriations. It had a pretty hefty, and so appropriations is where we go to find the money, the funding, to be able to pay for whatever provisions we need to that are in the bill, the policy. And so it was sitting in appropriations when we went on a temporary adjournment because of COVID in March. When we were getting ready to come back at the end of May, what really was being bestowed upon us was the fact that we were facing a huge deficit, up to $4 million cut into our budget, which for Colorado is a lot because, I'm sorry, 4 billion, wrong one. I do that a lot.
More zeros there.
It was a lot of money because we also have a lot of other kind of tax issues in the state of Colorado that's very unique to us. And I'm sure other states have probably things that are unique to them as well. But regardless of that, the big push was, we can't really pass anything that's going to cost money. And really that's going to cost a significant amount of money. Opening up this programming to more folks that were incarcerated was going to cost money. And so a lot of it came down to funding. We also were still getting a lot of pushback from our DAs Association, and then also from victims' rights groups. And so that's really where we still have a lot of work to do with those groups to get to a good place. And we've done a lot of work around restorative justice, and that's how we want to incorporate the victims piece. And there has been some really groundbreaking work in Colorado around restorative justice. And so just building upon that for this particular bill. And we hope that we can actually reintroduce that in January. We still don't know what awaits us for our January session, which I don't know if, I'm sure other legislatures are dealing with the same issue that our part-time legislatures. But we also, so I sit on our commission for criminal and juvenile justice, and we have a sentencing reform task force. And I'm sitting on that committee as well. And I am hoping, because there's been a few of us that have talked about what if we look at sentencing reform for this population? What does that look like, so that we can stop it at the front end rather than trying to fix it at the back end?
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. It's going to be an interesting time with COVID, among other things hitting the budget. And there's often the argument of, short-term expense, but of course, long-term savings, right? I mean, not to mention human savings of human lives, but having people be released and be, in our communities versus the government keeping them behind the wall, and adding those years. So we hear you, a challenge. So Councilmember Allen, I think you had some hearings on this about 18 months ago. I could be wrong. And I'd love you to sort of tell us where you think you are, not you personally, but not to put you on the spot, but the council, and how it's going, and if you have any tea leaves predictions of the future, if you could share that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again. Listening to my colleague in Colorado's experience around kind of the arguments that people will make, it's very familiar. So what we ran into was, and I guess I should back up very briefly to make sure for folks who aren't familiar with DC's system, just so you understand what we're up against. So remember DC, and I got to put a plug in, of course, we have over 700,000 DC residents. That's more than the state of Wyoming, more than the state of Vermont, basically the same size as Alaska. We don't have statehood. So our system would be, if I asked you to go into a room and come up with the worst possible system you could come up with, this is what you'd end up with. All the prosecutions are done by a U.S. attorney, which is appointed from the Department of Justice. So we have a federal prosecutor that has no accountability to us. They essentially prosecute all of our cases, including if a 16 or 17-year-old is going to be tried as an adult. We then have a non-local court, our superior court, which are federal judges who make those decisions. And then once convicted, our resident leaves our control and goes into the Federal Bureau of Prisons, shipped out all over the country, which then makes, of course, successful return very difficult in many cases. So our system is one of the worst you could come up with. So in this current political environment, it was not surprising that we had the Trump appointee last summer just attack with a broadside around the same things. We're going to be just letting sex offenders just run loose through the city. Violent murderers are just going to be put out everywhere. It was so hyperbolic and so outlandish. It actually ended up backfiring. They went so hard that actually people who had been a little bit more skeptical actually came in and said, whoa, 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 this is our system. We get to make decisions around this, and really in a great way push back. We also have an incredible group of just leaders and voices in the district now, just to call it a couple of them. I mean, the Justice Policy Institute, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Sentencing Project, School Justice Project, the Second Look Project, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, all have just done an incredible job of reaching out, educating, and helping get us to a better place. So where are we now 18 months later? We're very close. I feel like I can see the finish line when it comes to our IRA 3.0, which is what we call it. It has taken a lot of work. It's taken work working with my colleagues. We have a 13-member legislative body. I've got to get out a committee, which is a committee of 5 people. And I'm increasingly confident with all of those steps. We've worked very closely with a lot of victims and survivors organizations the benefit is we start from a place where they fundamentally understand the systemic racism and injustice of the criminal justice system, and they want to be a part of solutions. So we've actually had a really great collaborative relationship around how do we get to our end goal, and at the same time, recognize and work with survivors in a way that moves things forward. And we've also had now several years worth of experience with our first parts of IRA. I believe there's a total, there's more than 50 people that have now come home, and they're doing great. And that kind of creates a really great track record to be able to help show the successes that have taken place. And to the critics who say, well, you're just opening the doors to anybody. There also have been people who have applied for that resentencing and been denied. And so you can now show a track record of the just great success stories of people coming home and the great job that they're doing. And to the people who want to say, well, you're just doing something horrible and you're opening up all these doors and you're going to put me at risk, you can show the court is independent. And the way in which our sentencing review would work is it's done by the Superior Court. They can show this, it's an independent review. But what we're trying to do is just not relitigate the offense when somebody was 16, 17, 18, 19 years old over and over and over again. And so I think that I'm very optimistic. I think that because we've worked hard and really because there's just this incredible group of people around us helping make this happen, we're on the verge of being able to move the next big step forward in the district. And where we go after that needs to continue to be based on the data and the science and the experience, but also with the urgency of recognizing that we have a system that is inherently broken, it is inherently unjust, and it drips of the racism that exists. And so I think that we're about to take a great big step forward, and we're going to celebrate that when we get there. And then we're also going to, of course, have the continued work that we've got to do to keep taking those steps, because as monumental as this will be, it still isn't going to represent, the final step on the journey.
Great, thank you very much. Justice Policy Institute just released 2 reports on emerging adult justice in DC, looking at the DC population, which like all the populations, right, the racial ethnic disparities is shocking, right? Just shocking. And they also have a great report written by mentors in the Young Men Emerging unit. So hopefully we can get that up on the chat, the links. I'm not going to do it, but hopefully somebody in my team will be able to do that. And I also just want to say that for the Emerging Adult Justice Project, we have an online library with resources about bills, new studies, newspaper articles, videos, podcasts on this topic, and it's eajustice.org. And that would include the JPI articles, the reports. It will include the one that we're talking about today on parole and resentencing. So hopefully people will be able to use that and access that as well. We're closing out. So I want to give our panelists a chance to say one more quick thing if they feel like they want to put in that one plug before I get a chance to thank them. So maybe we'll go kind of in the reverse order. Charles Allen, you mind starting, and then we'll go on up.
Yeah, the things that I really would leave people with is finding ways to really understand and highlight the power of hope. Again, it is a consistent story that we'll hear, and we got to make sure that we respect and push that forward to recognize the transformative power that it has. And then, of course, working hard to build out these really strong coalitions. I know that I couldn't do nearly the things that we're doing without just a really strong coalition and the incredible voices of those with lived experience that actually help us get this done. So those are 2 big takeaways, I think, for everybody.
Super, thank you. Representative, do you have a sort of a closing statement?
I don't know that I have anything specific to add, but I do want to give time to John, like just based on that fact, right, that hearing those personal stories are really important. And that's how a lot of us implement policy, is by listening to our community members.
Great. John.
Yeah, I would just say, just remember that, these is lives at stake, right? One day, a child could, change, right? So one day is important. And so we take all this time to pass these laws and to think about how can we deal with our youth. I'd say keep in mind that these could be your children, right? And I say deal with them as if they were your children, and move at a pace that you would want everyone to move with for your child. and act and make change as though you were doing it for your child. Because ultimately, all children belongs to the community, right? And a lot of us end up in those systems because we don't have the best upbringing, right? And you can be a catalyst and a change in a child's life just by putting those things in place to help them become better, to help them boys and young girls become good people, right? Good adults. The community will benefit from it. You will benefit from it. Give back the hope. Give them incentive, right? Give them the tools they need to change. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. Frankie, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just for everybody out there who's, interested in possibly doing something like that in their home state, youth offender parole processes. I just want to, two things. One is, let's make sure that we don't do things that are just simply a formality, whether it's a hearing, a second look, or a parole process that really doesn't have a developmentally appropriate framework in order to be able to understand and evaluate a young person's growth and maturity, right? And so to simply create a process that allows a person to go to court just to be shot down, I think could be extremely disempowering and would have negative effects on morale and this, not frivolous factor of hope. So, what we did in California was emphasize that the board should give great weight to the hallmarks of youth, and this great weight determination really leans heavily in support of a presumption that the young person should go home unless we find something different. And so that has been powerful in the way that we've been able to be successful with the implementation of our youth offender parole laws. And second, passing the law isn't enough. I think that we really need to make sure that we invest in the programming to make it available. In California, I'll say we do a particularly terrible job at resourcing and financing programs that come into prison. And even though we do have them, it's because of the community that comes in on a volunteer basis to provide these programs. And, we benefited and I have to acknowledge the community support for that. But I think our state and other states need to think about how to resource these programs. So again, it isn't just an opportunity with no substance, but actually something that people can avail themselves of, but also investing in a culture of rehabilitation within the ranks, within the, the guards and the administrators, so that they understand the priority here is to help people be better, because for too long, prisons haven't done that. And so, that's my two takeaways. And I just wanted to offer myself as a resource or support to Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez, as well as to Council Member Allen, or anyone else out there. If you want to talk or, work through some of these things, I'm happy to help.
That's a great way to end. I want to thank the panelists very, very much. You are amazing. You've done incredible work. You definitely give me hope. Sometimes it's hard these days to see that. So this was very refreshing for me. And I would just echo what everyone says, but also the idea that we want to be a resource, we want to be helpful. And so as people listening in are in jurisdictions where they're sort of taking this journey and thinking about parole and resentencing, they're thinking about emerging adult justice reforms, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, to say the least. And we would like to be helpful and supportive. So I also hope you've got these experts on the panel, and the EAJ project is also happy and willing to help in any way that we can. So thank you all a ton. Really appreciate it. Wonderful conversation. And I hope people will read Natalie's paper, which is excellent and a great resource, and check out other resources that are out there on the topic. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.